Taking a look today at the rotational grazing plan that I have for the winter and trying to figure out where and when I want the animals to move through each of the different pastures and for how long. One of the things that you have to plan for when looking at animal grazing is how long can you let them be in an area before they start to damage the soil instead of help improve it. And if you look at the history of the American West especially, but also the events of things like the Dust Bowl, we have a long history in America of not really understanding how we're farming and what we're doing that is good and what we're doing that is not good with our animals and with our crops. So very important to have a good plan. So what constitutes a good plan? Well, you want to have a rough idea of what's called the carrying capacity of your landscape, which is based off of the size of the enclosed area or paddock, pasture if you really prefer, and the number of animals and the type of animals, as well as their age, basically what they're going to be eating, how much they're going to be eating, what their nutritional needs are. Goats are very different from sheep, very different from cows, very different from pigs, and even within each of those types of animals, some forage better off grass than others, and some prefer a more varied diet. There are types of pigs that are primarily grass-fed and prefer that, and there are types of pigs that exist on grass only as a very last resort, a backup plan if you will. So we have Smokey, the mama, we have 2 boys, and we have 6 goats. So it's not a lot for our acreage, and I really didn't know until I had the animals on the land for this year what level of impact they would have. So previously this had been a fairly heavily grazed sheep farm with far fewer paddocks to separate out where the sheep would be at a given time. And there were horses as well, and both horses and sheep tend to shear the grass very close to the ground, much closer than a cow will preferentially do, and much about the same honestly as what a goat will do if a goat is forced to eat grass as kind of their main forage. So I have boers, and boers are not great grazers, but they're not bad grazers. They will eat grass as a backup plan. They prefer seed head, from what I've been able to tell, is a big one. And then surprisingly, both the cow, Smokey and her boys, and the goats also really enjoy things like dandelion heads and even dandelion leaves. And there are certain weeds that I've been watching that they do seem to ingest. There's a book that I was reading some time back that talks about the medicinal plants that animals will ingest to keep themselves parasite free and healthy. They don't have vitamins, right? So it's not like if they need something they can just go to the drugstore. They've got to find it within their landscape. And so dandelions make sense. Dandelions are a weed according to modern standards. They used to be considered a culinary food and were actually encouraged to grow in many people's yards in parts of the world because they have a lot of minerals. Dandelions are very good at sending down roots really deep, not just at the surface, like a grass will mostly be at the surface depending on the grass. They'll send down the roots very deep, and they pull up the mineral content from the deeper layers of soil, and the animals need that as part of their diet. Some plants the animals will ingest because they are like at a low level, they're poison, and the animal's okay if they don't eat too much, but oftentimes it will kill whatever is bothering the animal's insides, parasites or whatnot. So it's a very interesting book, and one I've been looking at. You can see right now, like all the fresh green grass, the goats are eating that preferentially. to what little is left in the form of seed head, and they're quite happy with it. So this is where they've been, well, where they always have access to. This is our sacrifice yard, just here above the barn. And you can see the cistern assembly there, rainwater collection. This up here is what I call sacrifice yard 2, and they've had access to this as well. It's more of a forest area up in here, just past here, and I'd like to run pigs up here as a secondary next year. So I'm really excited about the idea of that, and I've been researching out which pig, breeds I would like to bring up into here, but I'll rehabilitate this structure and make it a little bit safer, a little more sound, and a lot more useful for the pigs before we do that. But the bones are really solid, so it's just kind of rustic, built with a lot of wood off the place as in place of a wall. And honestly, I may even leave it outside of finding out just how winter hardy the pigs are. So the sacrifice yard, there's the house down there, or up above the barn. You can see when you look at the ground here, there's very little grass growing. There's a little stub right there. A lot of weeds, different weeds, mostly weeds that the animals don't prefer. They haven't been up here as long, so you can see that there's a good chunk of green grass coming in there. Why is that? Well, the sacrifice yard, as you would guess from the name, is an area that the animals always have access to and gets heavily trodden. So it's very compacted soil, it's constantly grazed, and in particular, one of the things I found with goats is that they want to graze all the time, but if they're not really hungry, they just almost eat anything. And that's the kind of the key piece. If they're hungry, they will travel. If they're not hungry, like actually hungry, they won't travel. They'll just stay where they're comfortable. They're very skittish animals. They have no means of really defending themselves from coyotes or other natural predators, so they will avoid that experience by just not being in areas they are not as familiar with if they don't have to be. So sacrifice yard and our barn are their home territory. That's the first paddock on the south side of the hill where the orchard area is, and our property has an additional 20 acres or so of forest, and it's not fully forested. There is like large little meadows and that sort of thing in there, and it's fenced off as well for animal grazing. Previous owners had sheep run the whole property, and at some point pigs, a lot of varieties of pigs, most varieties of pigs from my understanding, they're forest animals. They came out of the forest or the scrub land, and that's where they're most comfortable. So I'll graze them more onto this side of the hill. You can see over here we've got a gate, and this section will have an access way, kind of where I'm walking here, over to the far part of the forest for us to be able to move and rotate animals through. This up here, I'm going to almost entirely block off. So this area is a rock field, and the curve of the land is very hard to see with the scope of things. I said last time we'd talk a little bit about rain or spring water and how we were going to be changing the way we get water to our house. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. It involves this area, but I'm going to take you over to the area over here, this forest area. The animals have been on this section, which is a big paddock. It's probably 5 times larger as a single paddock, this middle section of the forest, than any of the individual paddocks on the South Hill, which the intention is to rotate the animals through quickly, and eventually I will subdivide this one, but I'm going to do it in a way that's more based off the geography and therefore a little bit more orientated towards the ideas of permaculture, whereas the South Hill I just cut it into chunks and not based off of access or anything like that. Like I gave myself a way to get to everywhere and the animals to get to everywhere based off the the placement of the barn, but it's not ideal. So here's the forest, And it's a beautiful forest. I've always loved the mix of fir and especially maple. There's also a lot of hazelnut, native hazelnut. There's a number of wild cherry, wild pear. Not any good for human consumption, but great food for animals and wildlife. There's a few holly mixed into the area over here. There's a few pine down this slope here. You can kind of see there's a dramatic drop that goes down to like a low wet section where a lot of the water of the hill ends up going to. That's got a little marsh, and there's some alder down there. There's a bunch of plants that don't mind really wet feet. So this is my forest. Sometime I'll take you on a tour of the forest. It's 20 acres, so it's a pretty fair walk. Well, about 16 probably, realistically. Sacrifice yard is several acres as well. So, but yeah, so as you can see, there's still a lot of blackberry. There's still, you can't really tell the grass from here. Further in, there's a bunch of areas where there was some tall, like forageable but not ideal dead grass. They ate some of that down, but now that the rains have come, and boy have they ever, for this time of year, it's been quite a bit of rain. The grass has really come back up, so they're just loving that flush of green, fresh growth. And this paddock has really not been impacted. So one of my learnings is, just as far as that goes, like there are areas where they've grazed heavily and areas where they haven't touched like hardly at all. So more subdivide, and I think that the carrying capacity we talked about earlier for this area is probably quite a few more animals than what I have, which is exciting. I want to add some more pigs, get a number of more cattle. I think I'll keep the goat herd in total between 6 and 10. They aren't really enough at 6, with most of them, being babies still, very well, younglings, I guess. Under a year. They just aren't eating as much as I would like, especially they're not motivated to eat the blackberries, which is a main concern of why I brought them in here, is to help control weeds. They're great at that. You have to watch them very closely, because if you allow it, they'll stay where they're comfortable, and comfortable spaces for goats is much more open, so they can see what's going on, and there's no surprises. So they prefer those areas over there, and they will eat them. They'll eat the preferential food for them down pretty heavily, and then go after the grass, and they'll crop it. Unlike the cows, they will crop it down. So yeah, so that's just a little bit on that. And then the other thing I want to chat about today, so our system of house water. You can see there's a little depression right here. It's this beautiful little, completely fenced off, animals can't access it. It has ivy everywhere, and I do not like ivy, but in this particular circumstance, the ivy is useful because it really provides a great ground cover, and the water, the soil is very protected here. So the water comes down this rocky, scree slope. It's not quite scree, but a thin layer of dirt over top of small and medium and large rock. And the fold of the land, up here, there's a high point that comes down like this. This is a lower point through here, like a valley. And then there's a bevel of land that comes like this from up there. So this is a watershed that comes down from this whole chunk of hillside. And there's like a natural flow of water underground here. I don't know whether it's truly like an artesian, to where the water is welling up from below, or whether there's just the natural path of water for the entire hillside comes this way. So the mass of plant matter protects water. So it's very possible that even in the middle of summertime, we were getting a nice heavy stream of about probably 0.8 or so gallons per minute, which in the course of a day is a lot of gallons of water. This time of year, when there's a rain event, it does increase, which tells me that the water is accessible to surface. And that's an issue that we want to correct. If it is something where the water is coming through the ground, which I believe it is because the entire summer we have it, you don't want rainwater getting into that supply. Rainwater brings in a lot of undesirable stuff. So first of all, it brings in the possibility of a disease carried from animals or from humans. And we do have one single neighbor way up the hillside, too far for me to really be concerned, but we do run animals through here, and there is a infinitesimally small, but a chance that something might get into the water supply if the water is coming from the surface runoff. So how do you combat that? You want the water to truly be coming from below the surface. So what needs to be done for us is two pieces. First, obviously it's impacted by rain. So we need to dig back to find the source of the spring water. And then we need to install a catchment basin and cover it, and then have a diversion path for the water to follow. So there is a pond space right here that's not, it only rarely gets a little bit of water caught into it, but the water sinks down through there. And then somewhere down in here past this tree, or right in that area, is where the water is, it looks like the water is being caught. It may be that it's this whole run here, but I want to find the primary source of that and catch it better, divert the water away, and prevent surface water with like a long-term impermeable surface, like a plastic sheet, a thick plastic sheet, more mils thick than you would typically get for an average application. Just a nice thick sheet of plastic. You could do it with something else, but honestly, the plastic is the best application for that, even in a permaculture setting, because it doesn't biodegrade. So let's walk up this way. So what right now is happening is the water comes down, we catch it in the spring, we'll go over here, it comes over to a catchment in the form of a cistern, an old concrete cistern that's right underneath that well house right there. 1,000 gallons. It sounds like a lot, it's not that much. It really isn't. Average household supposedly uses the majority of that in a single day. So it's good that we get regular replenishment. But yeah, so there's the well house. So it goes over to there, and then there's a pump in there, and then that feeds our house. So what I want to do is I want to bring it over, drop it, because the slope goes down, have it hit a ram pump. So essentially that cistern will become a backup, and that well will become a backup. The ram pump will push the water up this hillside here, and we'll take a walk up the hill to where we're going to be putting the new cistern, and we'll get a look at that. So you can see from the shape of the land, maybe a little bit here, that this is a definite slope. So I calculated out how much of a incline, the elevation changes, and it should be enough for us to end up with passive gravity water pressure when you get it down from the top to the house. So you have a supply line going up, and then you have I guess you have a supply line to the cistern and then a supply line to the house coming back down, and they're separate, but you can put them in the same trench. So we'll bring it up here and then have it passively feed back down, and that should give us about 35 pounds per square inch of pressure. So the average household is set between about 40 to 60, or some places you might go higher than that, but there's really no need to. You can run 2 showers at the same time and a couple faucets off of about 60 psi. So we're going to try it at 35, and it may be that the pressure is insufficient, and if need be, I can add it's like an inline pump. It's basically basically when the water is being pulled, it pushes the pressurization higher. Pardon me. So, gone up about 75 feet. So right here, in this quaint little forest park setting here, is kind of the high point of this section.